First speaker for the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, there's been a slew of US Supreme Court decisions, like for example Citizens United, like for example the Walmart class action civil suit, that has seen the increasing empowerment of corporations in our political and public life. And what we've been seeing as a result from this is that not only have they been increasingly empowered, but they've been able to flex their financial muscles to push their own viewpoints through. And what we suggest on this side is that it usually comes at the expense of individual and democratic rights. We think it's been further exacerbated in light of the kind of interest, in light of the interest and movements opposing corporate logic. For example, the increasing movement for climate change and the like, which we think further provokes and spurs them to invest into more think tanks, to further invest into more research institutes, to try and pervert public perception and public opinion towards supporting their own corporate logic. And we think this is particularly harmful. What we want to do is that we want to ban them from being able to invest in such an independent academic research, and we want to maintain and ensure that the dialectical discourse that exists within society remains fair and remains open, that we have the ability and the avenue to reply back against the corporate logic. So what we're going to do, it's simple enough. We're going to ban them from investing in academic research. We think this is fine, because for these corporations, they still have their own private research departments, which they use to research for whatever interests or incentives or motives that they have on their own part. What we basically want to do, like I said earlier, is maintain the discourse for the benefit and betterment of society. I'm going to talk about a couple of things, right? Firstly, I'm going to talk about principally why we think this is important, and we're going to examine the nature of corporation investment and nature of academic research and why we think the state has a duty to step in. And next, we're going to talk about why we need to step in to maintain the integrity of the outcome of research in these facilities and why that's massively important for the state. So first, principle. But before that, we need to understand a couple of things. Firstly, we need to understand, right, that corporations fight for their own interests, and the interests usually end up as being diametrically opposed to the interests of individuals or usually even majoritarian interests. Like for example, climate change is antithetical to whatever corporations, like for example BP, who operate on their conception of trying to exploit more resources for oil, to exploit more technology that sees the detriment of environmental conditions in certain areas in the world. So naturally, if they want to advance their own corporate logic, it comes at the expense of something else. And we think that something else is usually better for individuals and majoritarian societies. But not just that, right? We've seen how, for example, their increasing influence in, like, for example, think tanks like the Club for Growth, where they have people like, for example, BP and Amway exercising their largesse to influence public opinion and public thought. So we see how eminently political they have been. So we want the second characterization that we need to look at. What are academic research and why is it so fundamentally important? We think academic research are largely objective pieces of report coming from academic institutions. And we think this is particularly important, right? We give, for example, university professors things like tenure and some kind of protection to ensure the independence and integrity of their research. So we use it as a main avenue of opposition to other political viewpoints that may exist in the discourse that underlies society. So we think in that vein, especially since people resort to academic reports as the primary means of opposing such viewpoints, we think that characterization of academic research is important in us realizing why we need that in the field of discourse. And largely we argue, Mr. Speaker, the third characterization I need to go through is that single donators or people who extremely rich individuals or pockets of individuals who want to donate as a counter-check or counterbalance against corporate largesse usually doesn't work. Because no matter what you do, the individual will never be able to outspend a corporation. Even if you take even if you agree that certain individuals are billionaires, the rest of society who have such political motivations usually cannot compete against your BPs, your Amways and your Goldman Sachs. So there will always remain that kind of asymmetry that exists in terms of the ability to spend and the ability to influence. Recognizing all three, so we see what kind of discourse we're facing in society right now, and we think that the state has the very important duty to step in and protect the people from such insidious elements, especially since we're talking about discourse, where the effects and the nature of discourse is largely invisible to the common man. We think there's further incentive upon the state to step in and protect them. We don't think this is anything different. For example, we institute financial regulations to fetter corporations, preventing them from perverting financial and economic markets to protect the people at the end of the day. The principle similarly applies here. There is an inherent duty and we're fulfilling it on this side. So why must the state step in? And I have 4 reasons why they must step in. Firstly, we think that the state, on the back of the earlier analysis, has a motivation and has an interest to advance human knowledge and try as far as possible to push through different viewpoints in the hope that in the collision of different viewpoints, we reach the kind of median of consensus that will help us improve further. But what happens, right, when you allow corporations to invest their massive wealth into this academic research is that you turn away other people from similarly, like they're donating into these independent think tanks, independent researchers, and we think this is fundamentally detrimental because you shut down all other avenues. When a person realizes that he's competing against Goldman Sachs and he knows for a fact that he cannot compete with them on a financial basis, it pushes and deters them away from even wanting to donate in the first place. So the natural cascading effect of this, Mr. Speaker, is that you see the systematic shutdown of all other forms of avenues of discourse or all other forms of antithetical opinion that exist within society, and we think this is particularly harmful. Even in those areas that do exist, the small think tanks that will inevitably sprout out, we think they will do nothing and be powerless against the economic might of these corporations. So we think that's especially important. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we think what you basically do is that you give these corporations the sheen of respectability that comes only with the masquerade that, like, these independent academic researchers bring. Let's be clear, right? Nobody researches into who exactly funds think tanks or funds individual academic researchers. So that's largely invisible to people, and people will never have access to such information. Something that will be further exacerbated when you allow corporations to come in and further shield this away from any form of inquiry. And why is this important? Because as they push through such antithetical opinions to majoritarian interests, and they use the sheen of respectability that comes from think tanks or researchers like RAND, for example, we think this pushes their message, and people are blind to the fact that these were corporate-sponsored viewpoints, that these were corporate-sponsored projects. And what happens is that people buy into the respectability. We don't want that, Mr. Speaker, because we think that when it comes to political and dialectical discourse in society, everybody reserves the right to know what kind of viewpoint that is, and we want to expose that for what it is. Now the third point, Mr. Speaker, the benefits of free market logic and why that will be pilfered when you push through their policy. We need to understand one thing, like, for example, we think lots of good has come from independent research and open source collection of information. Like, if we talk about the pharmaceutical industry, because of copyright laws, what we see in most academic researchers in most universities is that they rely on open source logic and open source contribution to push through beneficial returns and outcomes from their research. What will basically then happen is that when you open up the floodgates and you tear down the walls of regulation, you allow corporations to dip their finger into almost every pot of research or every possible conduit for research that is out there. You effectively take out this kind of institutions, you take out this kind of platforms which allow for open source collective a collection of information, which we think is fundamentally beneficial. Because to them, these are pockets of opposition to the corporate logic that sees them benefit, and they're not going to allow it, and they're going to use the economic wealth that they have to guarantee their economic success. So we think that's particularly detrimental as well. And the last point, Mr. Speaker, we think what's particularly dangerous about the corporate logic is that it's extremely myopic. In the sense that even though we all believe that an alternative form of fuel is important to further help us all out in the long run, for companies like BP who have the money, that is fundamentally dangerous to what they think is good for them. Because they care about their quarterly profits, they care about the profits that they're going to get in the next couple of years. And for them, such forms of research into things that will be beneficial in the long run are fundamentally fatal to their own profit logic. And we think this will be similarly shut down as well. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, this important logic must stand.
Thank the speaker for his remarks, and I now like to call the first speaker for the negative.
Research works in Singapore, but in the rest of the world, you really can't use your economic wealth to fake scientific results or to fake sociological returns even, precisely because of the high visibility that these particular studies attract. In fact, even before any kind of academic research can gain traction, it must undergo several levels of falsifiability and being verified by other institutions. No one company presents something and is the only one who believes that, and then suddenly that gets accepted into mainstream discourse, we think this is a myth fed to us by affirmative. Imran told you two things in this debate. One, that corporations are going to produce discourse that is against majoritarian interests. And secondly, he told us that the rest of society will be overwhelmed by those particular interests and will be unable to respond. Why are both things wrong and not really realistic in today's debate? Let's look at the first idea, that these particular corporations produce anti-majoritarian discourse. As I explained earlier, a lot of their research will have to be verified, will have to be subject to other people trying to replicate those same results. That's why anti-climate change discourse in the United States hasn't gained much traction, because you have other people coming up with their own results and saying that objectively, there's just no way you can say it doesn't exist. And you do have interest groups, so go against it. That's why Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth is so very popular. But beyond that, we think the very presumption of that idea is that corporate interests are always and are automatically wrong and against society's interests. We think that this is true, and it's very undemocratic for a state that recognizes corporations as important actors in society to immediately assume that. Because sometimes corporate interests are in line with society's interests. That's what we saw happening in the financial crisis. They aren't always awful, they aren't always bad, and when they are bad and they are awful, we think the rest of society can fight back. And that's precisely where my second rebuttal comes in. We don't think the rest of society is overwhelmed. You have a very vibrant academic community. You have individuals who will attempt to falsify and, show that these particular results cannot be replicated and cannot be verified if they're coming up with something as bombastic as climate change doesn't exist. That's why no one really buys the idea that climate change does not exist even. And thirdly, you have to look at the way these kinds of research are conducted in the first place. It's not a matter of GSK funding its own research and that's it. It's accepted like that. Most of the time, these corporations partner up with other academic institutions to make sure that they have a veneer, they have a degree of objectivity. And because these institutions like Duke University or Stanford, for example, have their own interests to maintain, we think A, serves as an important check and balance, but B, that ensures they don't fake the results because it's their own names on the line as well. So we think they miss out by refusing to acknowledge the effects of this on the research community. Our stance is that we're perfectly happy with corporations sponsoring academic research, either on their own or in collaboration with other members of whichever relevant community it is, be it the sociological or scientific community. We think though these particular types of research have to face the same level of requirements of falsifiability and verifiability and being able to reproduce the results as any other particular research before it's accepted as academically relevant. I'm going to talk to you about two arguments in particular. The first is about the state having no right to limit those who can contribute to knowledge production. And secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why these corporations are crucial, in fact, to research. Let's talk about the first idea. The point of knowledge production, especially in the context of a democracy, is that, well, you're inclusive. You allow people and individuals with different interests to speak up and to contribute to knowledge production. We think, for example, that's how you got many breakthroughs. You had Foucault going up against Freud and Galileo going up against the very powerful Catholic Church. In the same way, we need these particular corporations to come up with their own research, whether it be right or it be wrong, because we think if it's right, it's going to get verified. If it's wrong, it's going to get falsified by whoever produces countering discourse. We think that's very important in the democracy. We don't think the state ever steps in and says that just because you're rich, just because you have economic wealth, your right to freedom of speech and your right to freedom of expression and information access should be limited. We think that's fundamentally undemocratic, and they've shown us absolutely no reason for that beyond the entire, well, they have their interests to protect. Following that train of logic, we wouldn't let Notre Dame or Boston College produce any research at all because they're Catholic and they have the Catholic discourse to protect. The truth of the matter is, any institution will have some sort of discourse or some sort of ideology or interest they want to protect. But in the free market, you allow research to exist, you allow different viewpoints to exist, because you assume, especially in the academic community, Imran, that people are smart enough to filter things and figure out which is right and which is wrong. I think that's very important. Basically, the conclusion of this argument is that there's no harm in their participation. It's an unfair curtailment of corporate rights to release studies for whatever reason, whether they think it's because it forwards their interests or because they want to disprove something they held so true earlier on and what it conducted by an academic institution. Let's talk about the same idea, why we think these corporations are in fact crucial to research. You have to understand that many things that we need done in society have relevant institutions, so financial interests in them. That's why we think GSK, that's why we think Pfizer are so important, and we need them to be conducting research. Some of your most important breakthroughs in medicine have come up from these particular corporations. We don't think the government, or Duke even, has the amount of money to invest in producing antiretroviral drugs or things like that. Cynthia, the first synthetic life form, was produced by corporations because the government was too scared to touch it. We don't think you're going to have those kinds of breakthroughs, not only for two particular reasons. If you depend entirely on the academe or you depend entirely on the government. We think there are two reasons for that. One is ideological barriers and two is financial barriers. Let's talk about the first idea. Even the state has ideological barriers and ideological stances when it comes to funding research. They might want to err on the side of, climate change exists, but it's not so bad, or things like taxation is important depending on who's in power. So we don't want to just leave it up to them. We think people, other individuals, other actors must be able to contribute to that discourse. Even in status quo, you don't have any research being done on stem cells because, well, the government has outlawed research on it, even if it's legal in California, New Jersey, and even Australia. We think without private corporations of the financial backing, you're never going to get any academic research out on that. But we think on the second level, you have to look at finances. There are lots and lots of things to research on, and there are, well, those things require lots and lots of money. In fact, right now, research into green technology is being funded primarily by these corporations themselves because they know sooner or later it's going to be too expensive and too unsustainable to depend entirely on oil. That's why even BP is involved in the production of knowledge on alternative technology. We think you are not going to get any types of scientific breakthroughs at all if you insist on shutting out the capacities of corporations. For all those reasons, we think negative should stand. We think you shouldn't set back the scientific community. We think you shouldn't be undemocratic. Thank you.
Let's call the second speaker for the affirmative.
Both sides of the House want greater research into different ideas. Both sides of the House want to explore different solutions, better ideas, fairer solutions. We want the marketplace of ideas, the most commonly used term in every debate. The question in this debate is, which side of the House better achieves it? The side that tells you we cannot allow large corporations to dominate the ideological dogma in the research field, and we should better allow for academic institutions to determine the direction of their own research, or the side of the house that wants to perpetuate the hegemony that corporations currently have. They never answered Imran's question in this debate. Why should we allow these corporations the disproportionate amount of power to direct the course of academic discussion? We never said they couldn't conduct their own research. Pfizer can go and research on whatever the hell it wants. Why should they be able to step into Boston University, for example, or any other form of academic discussion and be able to influence that disproportionately? They need to answer that question. On the very first level, they posed several feasibility questions. So they say, it's very hard to fake results. These academic institutions will not fake these results anyway. It's dangerous for them to do so. It harms their credibility. They have their own interests to maintain. Now, there are three responses to that. First of all, they misunderstood Imran when he told you that the research will be controlled and maneuvered. It's not about faking information so much as entrenching and underfunding certain other forms of information. So instead of saying, let's fund, for example, alternatives to not using cigarettes, cigarette companies will try and find ways, for example, to get people to think that cigarettes are not that addictive or not that dangerous. We think that it's this kind of focus on this sort of funding that dominates the kind of academic discussion that takes place. So we don't think it's simply about faking it. On the second level, we think it's also about tainting research. It's about saying that whatever research comes out of these institutions, of these universities, is tainted by the banner of some random corporation that can now say, this is mine. Now, there's several problems with that. First of all, you make this information a lot less credible. This is information that simply won't be viewed upon as something that's important or serious. But second of all, you shape the kind of discussion that needs to take place within academic circles. We rob these academics of the possibility and the capability to decide where they need to research on. Researchers now, in order to get the most amount of funding, because they are so dependent on these corporations, cannot say, for example, that cigarettes are bad, they do destroy your lungs, for example. We think that's problematic. They then said, look, the rest of society can fight back. That's how we realize that, climate change and global warming is bad. But on the very first level, we think this is one of the ways to fight back. The ability for society to stand up and say, this is our domain, academic research is our term, let us conduct it as neutrally and as fairly as we possibly can. But on the second level, we say there's never an objective truth. Society can always fight back, but there will always be naysayers who come up and tell you, look, global warming or climate change doesn't exist. And these are sort of opinions that come funded from corporations themselves. These are the corporations that manage to maneuver the kind of academic research we think that's bad. But on the third level, we think academic corporations have an additional amount, disproportionate power insofar as their ability to flood the academic discussion with their own versions of the truth, their ability to flood research with their own versions of the truth. So we think that their ability to overpower the kind of academic discussion with money and with their ability to entrench their ideological dogma is particularly problematic. They then told us, look, a lot of these universities have an interest to maintain their own reputations. They won't fake it. But we also think a lot of these institutions, when they become dependent on the money that comes from corporations, then have a greater interest to ensure that this money remains coming. Now, we agree and we concede that at some point, funds will be depleted. There's no way any individual can compete against the amount of money that comes from corporations. But we still think it's better that the research becomes broad-based as opposed to deeply entrenched in one way. We think it's important for a lot of these institutions to depart from the ideological dogma or the dominant mindset that is set by a lot of these corporations and to be able to explore alternatives, because that's what academic discussions are about. Academic freedom is especially important. On the third point of contention, they say the point is about knowledge production. It's about being inclusive in society about different ideas. Well, the first response to that is, how does flooding out ideas, how does giving corporations the power to flood ideas lead it to becoming more inclusive? They then give us the example of how Galileo managed to take on the Catholic Church. Mr. Speaker, make no hash about it. The Catholic Church was the religious corporation then, and it was able to flood out Galileo much more effectively than Galileo was any of their ideas. The question, the only solution came when the state came in as a neutral observer, and the state came in as complete completely non-religious and was able to balance out the ideas that came from Galileo. That's when he gained greater traction. That's why we think an independent and neutral participant is especially important. They then, and this is part of my substantive, told us that corporations have the right to shape this discourse. Imran already told you that corporations aren't people. They don't have the right. They're entities that are meant to be controlled. We tax them, we control them from producing certain drugs, for example. We control them from dabbling into certain into politics. We think that we already control a lot of these politicians. They're entities. They don't have that kind of right that you want to give other people. But then they then said, look, Pfizer has given a lot of good to society. They managed to contribute in terms of research. We think that's all fine and good when they do it independently. They've done it independently so far. And we also have allowed them or other academic researchers to independently prove them wrong. Pfizer is not going to publish information that shows certain drugs are bad. It took independent researchers to do that. And these were independent researchers, academic researchers, that were apart from Pfizer's production. So we think, and it's especially because these independent researchers such as Boston University, for example, were able to remove themselves from the taintedness that comes with a lot of these corporations, that their studies became legitimate. And that's the first benefit we say that comes from removing these corporations from the academic sphere. You create the air of legitimacy that's especially important if you want people to take academic discussion seriously. But on the second level, we say that the larger political battle needs to be fought. There's an increasing amount of regulation, environmental regulation, that needs to be pushed through. But the reason why this cannot be done so far is because corporations have such hegemony over the amount of research that takes place and over the kind of political backing it has. So for example, the reason why naysayers have such, in terms of climate change, have such strong power in the Senate and in the political arena is because they have corporations backing such large amounts of academic discussion and funding such academic discussion. We think that's problematic because first of all, it disproportionately reflects the kind of power that these guys have. But the second level, we think governments need to start reasserting control in these areas. We think that the only way that governments can do that is if it can empower academic discourse and academic discussion to the extent that academics are not afraid to say, I don't care if I get money from you or not, this is what the correct answer, or the academic research is, this academic research is particularly important, it needs to be put out independent of any influence. On the last idea of ideological biases, very quickly, we think of ideological bias always exists. We think it's important that the state doesn't pervert itself to the ideological bias of the corporation, but even if there is an ideological bias in favor of the state, we think it's better because the state represents the majority. That's where the bias should be in the
Let's call the second negative speaker.
What did we stand for in this debate? We said that the state should not have a monopoly on knowledge production. We don't think that there has to be, Mr. Speaker, evaluation of whether or not certain forms of knowledge and information are valid or useful to society before you've even embarked on the study. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that before the study has even begun, you have already made evaluation as to whether or not society can be served by that. We don't think that the policy of affirmative bench is principally correct. We don't think that it is socially beneficial. We don't think that this is at all a good thing. I'm going to talk about three things for you today. First, why exactly current funding is not enough according to their model. Second, whether or not the idea that more knowledge is pollution is something I'd like to discuss. And third, I want to talk about how this harms the very existence of academic research. Rebuttal will be integrated. To the first thing, is there a state imperative to do this, right? Like, we don't think that there is a real reason for the state to make this sort of blanket ban, because there is research that the government simply cannot and does not provide for. There are several reasons for this. The first one probably being the idea of a lack of resources, which they've already conceded. But more to the point, there is also research that doesn't get pursued simply because there are often political considerations that block getting these things funding, right? Like, often, Mr. Speaker, there are considerations that provide states with little to no incentive to engage in it. That is why it takes a lot of time for you to be able to get funding across the House Appropriations Committee for a project like stem cell research or perhaps some gene therapy research. Like, these are not things that the state can appropriate money for, not just because there is a limited amount of resources, but also because politicos often have an incentive to simply pander to the majority will that this side of the House seems to think is most important. We think that letting knowledge production be controlled by political considerations not only backtracks the promotion of a social good, but also limits the discourse on what that social good is to begin with. Well, we would agree that most corporations are self-interested. We contest the idea that academics are not self-interested when they are seeking glory. We contest the idea that NGOs are not, Mr. Speaker, self-interested when they are seeking to bring down other actors in society. And we contest the idea that politicians aren't self-interested either. Therefore, their main line of contention actually doesn't really stand. What we do think, Mr. Speaker, is that these individuals have every incentive to try and block things simply because they are unpopular, regardless of the social good. Therefore, we think that the state has a responsibility to encourage research, regardless of who it comes from, instead of trying to deny access to this research before it's even begun. Let's talk about the second thing. Is the knowledge produced really simply a pollutant in the political discourse? Like, we've already foreshadowed that we don't think anyone really exists for no self-interest, because that's really how it works. Like, everybody has an advocacy, that's how it goes, right? Imran's entire speech is premised on the idea that more knowledge is good, except for knowledge that are stumbled upon as a result of corporate funding. And their main line of analysis for why they are bad is because corporations have a lot of money. What we would suggest, Mr. Speaker, is that given the fact that these corporations have a lot of money, and they say that corporations are going to be able to conduct their own research outside of the academe, the economic machinery that they are so afraid of, Mr. Speaker, will still be able to conduct research and perhaps make falsified claims, which can no longer be peer-reviewed, which no longer goes through the academe. At the end of the day, if they're afraid of research being skewed in a certain direction, these corporations are more likely to have the space to be able to skew that research and to be able to accomplish these reprehensible things in a paradigm wherein they are not working with another entity who has more ethical standards with regard to how they conduct research. If that is the claim, it's worse on their side. So Hannah then says that it's not about the falsification of statistics, it's not about the falsification of scientific knowledge, right? So we can therefore then assume that some of the things that corporate funding does come about with are true. So basically, they actually have a problem with entrenching the truth, right? Because they said it's not about the corporations lying or academicians lying. It's about the entrenchment of what has already been generally believed. And if that were the case, we don't think there's really a problem with the truth being promoted to the rest of society. We don't think, therefore, that if that were the case, this is actually a harm. To the third thing, which is most important, the idea of how this affects the calculus with regard to knowledge production. Because universities and think tanks do not have a limited, or they have a limited pot from which they can get resources from. And you see this, Mr. Speaker, in certain instances, like they slash funding for graduate students or general studying. You see this, Mr. Speaker, in the idea that they focus less practical fields in funding the academe. That's why grad students and members of the academe often serve as cautionary tales to the rest of us that you shouldn't pursue this because there isn't enough money, and most of the time these people are begging for grants. Basically, Mr. Speaker, what you will have in the calculus of those who allocate funding will be they would want to bank on the sure things, right? Like, they're not going to be willing to take the risk. It's no longer going to be simply about what is morally acceptable to them and things like that. It's about trying to get a sure return on the investment that you've already made. Because if the returns are too uncertain, which is often the case in scientific research and requires repetitively failing, which is also often the case in scientific research, before you do succeed, the only individuals who will be able to take that, risk are those entities that are capable capable of doing so. Basically meaning the fact that they have a lot of money is basically the main reason why they would more likely to take that risk and make that leap. The question then becomes, Mr. Speaker, is there even going to be a is there going to be significant academic research without corporate funding, right? Because what we would suggest is that wouldn't be the case. And the added benefit of having corporate funding in this regard would be, at the very least, all of the advocacies they wanted to promote would then have more money because the opportunity cost would have been less in order for them to be able to get some level of investment from the university or the think tank that would want to conduct this research. We completely disagree with the idea that corporations have no rights. Because basically, what she said is that because a corporation is not a person, and because you tax corporations, they therefore have no rights. Like, we tax people too, right? Like, these things are entities, they do have rights as well. This is just completely absurd. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that there can or should be a determination of the value of knowledge before that knowledge is even produced. We think that corporations have a perfectly legitimate right in trying to claim that their facts are true, and that these facts, Mr. Speaker, can be verifiable. Most of the time, these are the kinds of corporations and legal entities that are perfectly willing to take on those risks, such as that of stem cell research, because the general public is not going to be into that, and therefore politicians wouldn't want to fund it, but universities also wouldn't really be into that unless they have like a zillion, billion, trillion dollars, because these are unsure returns. But you will have corporations and Genentech and all of these companies who would want to invest in that sort of research precisely because they know that even if they lose a lot of money now, there might be some returns in the future. So what you do have, Mr. Speaker, is not only better general knowledge production, but you also have a society that benefits from these things as well. What we would suggest is that the other side of the house saying that, well, you know, we would have antiretroviral drugs anyway, as a result, regardless of whether or not corporate funding is there, is a bit of a myth, right? Because at the end of the day, all of these things, Mr. Speaker, are spurred forward as a result of money being available. What you will have is either, even if we do get all of these benefits as a result of the policy of affirmative, what you will have is that it will take slower, it will take longer, we're all going to have to suffer. We are proud to oppose.
I call the first speaker for the affirmative.
Now, in a context where corporations have successfully pushed for things like unlimited funding in Congress, where they fund both parties in the American Congress to adhere to the interests, in a context where they're flooding think tanks like the RAND Corporation, like the Club for Growth, to flood the airwaves to influence society to their interests, in a context where corporations have made themselves explicit opponents of environmental and banking regulation throughout the United States and throughout the First World, the key question in this debate is it wise to allow these entities very clearly outline interests to influence the sphere of academic, not research as a whole, but academic research? That is the key question in today's debate. And I'm going to look at two issues in this debate. First, the necessity of corporate funding, and secondly, the effects of corporate funding on research and whether that will be detrimental. First and foremost, the issue of necessity. And the key crux of logic coming from that side of the house is that we need this funding to push the boundaries of human knowledge. And by the way, corporations have rights. On the first level, we agree, and this is the smallest point, corporations do have rights, but the rights are awarded to them insofar as they facilitate human rights, like the right to commerce. When it does not, we limit their rights through things like labor standards and environmental standards, which are, by the way, things that corporations are trying to undermine right now. But secondly, we are not restricting their rights entirely at all. They still have the right to employ their own scientists. The very company they talk about, like Pfizer, like Monsanto, spend millions of dollars every year on their own scientists in their own corporations anyway, and they fulfill the interests of market-based research very, very well. The question they have to answer, and they fail to answer, is why exactly are these not enough to fulfill corporate interests and corporate research, and why exactly do they need to incur into the territory of economic research? And that's my next point of rebuttal. The nature of academic research is characterized by Imran that they've never, ever engaged with, because the paradigm of academic research has never been solely about usefulness to society or the profit incentive. It is to push
push for the boundaries of academic knowledge, even though they may violate transient political trends or transient economic trends, for instance. That's why you have things like security of tenure, to ensure that things that may not necessarily be popular, they may not be opposed, but they can still advance the field of human knowledge. Like evolution in the time of Charles Darwin can potentially still have a place. And this is very important because things like theorems and equations take decades upon decades to do it. That's how it's different from economic and corporate research, ladies and gentlemen. The question they have to answer is why these two particular interests should be mixed. Later on, I'll show you how their policy will undermine this crucial space for academic research. The last point they say is the idea of ideological biases if alternatives are allowed in. On the first level, there is a concession that one particular ideological bias within the field of research is bad, and as long as we show you later on that corporations have a disproportionate effect in terms of ideological bias, we already win this debate. Secondly, they say that governments will dominate. On the first level, we never say that government will be the sole provider of money for this particular research. That is just disingenuous. Even as I say things like rich individuals, the universities themselves, even local groups like the NUS1 will also fund research, and there was the number in the millions and millions of dollars. It may not be the $300 billion that Goldman Sachs have, but research can still be done, ladies and gentlemen. And the question that they have to answer is why would these people not walk away once corporations start to fund them? Why would these people who may have private interest in advancing private knowledge that may not be linked to corporations, what say will these individuals have anymore once corporations are able to dominate the discourse? And even if government has overweighting it, why do you think government once represents the majority, and whilst we think they should not dominate, they should still have a say as well. Corporations, on the other hand, are different, like I was saying just now. Lastly, they say we don't like political corporations. That is very weird because we have characterized and have never disagreed that corporations are eminently political. They're always involved in the political process, always trying to influence Congress, always trying to influence the president. So how exactly is their political influence necessarily worse off? They've never once engaged with that. So we have never shown that there's a fundamental necessity that corporations, with all their largesse and nature of their interest, necessarily influencing academic research. So let's look at the second issue, the effects of their policy on academic research. A few points here. The first thing they said, that Ellie said, was that this will diminish risk-taking. That doesn't make sense. Profit-motivated corporations are the ones who are most likely to disincentivize risk-taking because they are based on results, ladies and gentlemen. If you want things, academic theorems, for instance, equations to come, you need decades upon decades of trial and error for that to happen. Corporations, on the other hand, want results, and the chances of them pulling the plug on a particular research that may not produce results in 2 or 3 years is immense. That is when you disincentivize risk-taking, not under our particular paradigm, where private researchers may be more indulgent in terms of trial and error. The second thing they say is that there's greater visibility, there are checks and balances, they will never ever lie. 2 responses to this. We think firstly, in terms of things like think tanks, the RAND Corporation, generally, and Imran has already said this, people don't know which corporations are funding which particular think tank. The Joe voters were influenced by corporations flooding the areas through things like the RAND Corporation, like the platform. Hell, like Fox News, ladies and gentlemen, don't generally see whether or not Amway or Goldman Sachs is funding them or not. So we cannot allow them this particular sheen of respectability. If you're fighting for corporate interests, they must be seen to be fighting for corporate interests. Imran's point they never dealt with. But secondly, I say this time and time again, this nuance in our case, they don't have to lie. All they have to do is to de-emphasize certain research, fund one particular research more to crowd out other research that will be against their interests, like for instance, research combating the rise of fossil fuels or things like that. They say we are blocking truth from coming out. We bring you the radical proposition that there's no such thing as an objective truth. Only aspects of the truth that can be emphasized and de-emphasized, and we think corporations will emphasize the aspect of the truth that is beneficial to them, and that is incredibly harmful. This brings me on then to the last point and most important point. Do corporations work against social interests? And they say they could not. On the first level, they've never contexted with our context. The intrinsic to corporations are certain interests that are antithetical to social interests. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, because they work on the basis of quarterly reviews and quarterly profits. That is why if there's a new technology, a new alternative fuel that could potentially lower people's reliance on oil, for instance, and that hurts a quarterly profit, which is incredibly short term, then chances are they might discontinue that, they might not fund that. Secondly, we say they often oppose non-market-based solutions, like open source research into drugs, for instance, that Imran talks about. They may not be all there is, but it's an invaluable path that should continue to be researched. In all this context, we think they crowd out certain aspects of the discourse, certain aspects of knowledge that should still be there. But secondly, even if they do not work against social interests per se, I think both sides agree that they work towards self-aggrandizement. That is always the purpose of corporate corporation, this is where the most important part of our case comes in. When you compare the $800 billion or so that Goldman Sachs has to fund research against everyone else who could potentially fund them, who have competing priorities, who do not have money for millions upon millions of taxpayers to influence research, we think their influence will be disproportionately large. And even if they say that these individuals have some socially beneficial outcomes, we think these outcomes will come at the expense of crowding out other equally important fields of research. This is especially important since their influence can already be advanced through corporate funding, through corporate scientists, ladies and gentlemen, who do not necessarily work in academia. Under these circumstances, we think democracy is predicated on everyone having some say and no one being overly crowded out. And we think they create this crowding out effect that is incredibly detrimental. Lastly, even if their influence isn't malignant, this is what Emma told you, the perception of malignant interest will still be there, ladies and gentlemen. What are the chances of other people willing to fund them, willing to trust academic research if they know the taint of BP with its oil spill mess is behind that particular research? We think that is very bad, and they'll also discredit academic research, and we also do not want that. Ladies and gentlemen, as someone who's hoping to drop a very stressful law career for a career in academia, I don't want corporations influencing my research. I want research to be free, I want speech to be free, and that is why I am proud to propose.
I'd like to call now the third speaker for the negative.
Mr. Chair, simply put, there's no such thing as too much information when it comes to research and development. This is because the plurality of knowledge allows for the negotiation of such information when it comes to the marketplace of ideas. It will allow the world to constantly question whatever information you provided, and it will never go untouched. Under their model, they want these companies, the self-interested, evil companies as they'd like to portray them, full capacity to make whatever information they want seem real and absolutely true, without any counterbalance, without any counter-check from that of academes. And that, Mr. Chair, is the saddest mistake that they've made in today's debate. Because under their logic, you will still have these informations out there considered and recognized as acceptable and legitimate, because these researchers within those companies will also have degrees wherever they're studying. So it means there's still legitimate information. So that kind of logic won't fly in today's debate. I'll further show you how the negative side of today's debate, one, based on 2 points of clash. First, is there an inherent harm to pluralistic and multi-sourced information? Basically, whether or not the academe should play a part in this as well. Second, where is quality information and research best achieved? Let's go to the first question, the inherency of the harm of this kind of information. They argue that the corporations have overpowering control of the academic discourse based on 3 levels. Let's go to the first one. They claim that they are so rich that they can control the results to their favor. Mr. Chair, let's look back into the 50s when smoking was a big issue in America, where there were so many smoking companies proving that smoking isn't bad and it's actually healthy if you smoke more cigarettes. Of course, even without, for example, corporations funding information that will counter that, they still, Mr. Chair, had a lot of individuals proving that it was deadly, mostly because people were dying on the streets of Manhattan because of the amount of cigarettes they were taking in. It means that research was still possible even given this, but the best part about it, Mr. Chair, was that because of this research that proves that it was unhealthy and there was no way for corporations to counter that, what happened next was they proved and made research to that the harms of smoking can be minimized. It means even these corporations will obviously be smart enough not to go with an absolute lie and stick with it forever. Research will always be about facts, will always be about things that you can prove. And these are things that the academe can help them with as well. The academe will benefit, would be a part of the negotiation of this kind of information. Mr. Chair, in the end, you can't make lies into truths just because you have money. I'm not sure how they do it in their side, but realistically, no matter how much money you have, you won't make up actual facts. The second level of this analysis is that they claim people who might want to counter this information will get so scared that they're up against the big bucks. Never mind that their third affirmative speaker contradicted their entire team by saying that they're willing to depend on other sources of information to now corporation funding. It means they also have money. It means we can make sure that there will still be research, and that was the solution that they wanted anyway, so the harm isn't even real. But more than that, we say that it's not sure why it would be like this, because really it's not like they're poor anyway. These countering institutions are also rich and capable. Greenpeace, the United Nations, World Wide Fund, UNESCO, etc. Sorry. These are institutions which have a lot of money coming in from very different and large institutions as well. So if you're talking about the big bucks, they're also just as rich. And beyond that, they never responded to the analysis coming from our side as well, that these corporations will also be smart enough to start researching things that will be beneficial, that they want. Green energy, Mr. Chair, is being researched more by corporations than they ever will be by that of the state, because they cannot afford it. So under that logic, Mr. Chair, there's already a social good, so that's good. We're okay with it already. But then the next level of the analysis for this is that they claim information is inherently against the social good. Never mind, they never actually proved this. They just kept on asserting that research, for example, to show smoking is healthy is bad. Mr. Chair, if we can find research out there that smoking is healthy and it's something that won't kill you, that will make me feel much, much better about Ellie's lifestyle. It will make, ladies and gentlemen, everyone so much happier not to blame smoking for something that isn't actually for it to blame for. Meaning, information, as long as it is real, is a social good. It doesn't matter if it seems like it's counterintuitive with certain state standards right now, because those things change. We've proven that with showing you Galileo. We've proven that showing you every single other scientific research out there. We think it's quite ridiculous for them to say that the only thing that's good is for you to agree with the state right now, because that won't help you in the end. Social good, Mr. Chair, apparently coming from third act, is when you allow these companies to have a certain level of social good, i.e. commerce. Well, letting them research, Mr. Chair, and having that validated by another institution, by the academe, is also going to help the commerce, because we're going to make sure we don't kill people out there because they're basing their research simply on their own money and simply on their own research institutions, which you claim to be faulty. In the end, Mr. Chair, we think that the need for funding is something they still haven't addressed, given the fact that we stand firm that there will still be a large difference between money coming from these corporations and these institutions. We think right now it's sufficient to counter it, but it's still better when we have this number of companies giving us money. But then they next claim these companies can research on their own. Why do we involve Boston College? Mr. Chair, I don't understand their logic. They think that these companies are evil and are total liars, but they're willing to leave them on their own completely to give information to the world. It's not as if the scientists will suddenly lose their degree and their diploma and their thick CVs just because they work in a corporation. They will still be just as legitimate. They will still use this information to fool people out there, and you will still have to give them their money when you buy their cigarettes. In the end, Mr. Chair, there is no real loss. If anything, there is an inherent benefit in having the academe who cares about their reputation, who cares about other companies hiring them and proving that they're not liars, and things like these will actually help us make sure that the information is double-checked. So really, Imran saying that people don't know where the information comes from is actually detrimental to them, because if under that logic, information coming from these companies will still be there and accepted by the individuals out there. Second question, where is quality information and research best achieved? They claim that academe becomes the corporate bitch now. Basically, they control the money. We will do anything and everything that you want to do. Mr. Chair, as much as I want Robin to have a great career as a researcher if he so desires, I don't think he'll have enough money when corporations decide to abandon a lot of these things because it's no longer an actual option. Because really, a lot of research is being done in the academe are normally funded by corporations to begin with. It means that they won't even have research at all if you don't even have these corporations there to give them the money that they need. In the end, Mr. Chair, we think as long as those information are factual, we don't care if it's tilted towards proving a certain goal, because in the end, if it's faulty, it will be disproved. First negative, we'll care about they forgot the entire analysis coming from the first negative of it being important to care about their own reputation and preserving the truth. But the next idea under this question, they said that there is a crime of omission happening because you don't fund anti-corporation research. As a corporation, you have failed. Mr. Chair, I think it's inherentwistic to argue that these corporations focus on things that help themselves. But that doesn't mean that they can't give us actual facts. It's the same logic as saying that they have an inherent incentive incentive to win, thus by saying that we shouldn't listen to affirmative anymore. That isn't true because we are here to disprove whatever they say and to show you that it is still legitimate to think like this. We think in the end, even if there is a sin of omission, this sin of omission is being rectified by a lot of other factors out there in the world. Affirmative never responded to the lack of funding. They never responded to the lack of absolute academic research. When you take away a huge chunk of its financing, people who want to research, even if it's not counterintuitive with state roles right now, will never happen. That's why negative should go to exams.
I'd like to call the reply speaker for the negative.
We don't think NUS1 has given us any real reason to ban corporations from tying up with academic research. Two things. First, should corporations have a say in social discourse? Second, is there a need to tie up for the preservation of academic integrity? The first thing, should corporations have a say in social discourse? This side of the house is not against corporations doing their own research, right? Which basically implicitly concedes that they have a right to a say and a right to contribute and influence that social discourse. Their main problem was that it was tying up with the academe. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that if you implicitly concede that there might be a value to what corporations had to say in order to be able to influence that social discourse, you actually have a leg to stand on in this debate. They seem to think that because we agreed that corporations were self-interested, it meant that we think all corporations should do nothing and they were evil straight away. Like we think and argue that sometimes it's against the social good, sometimes it isn't against the social good. We talked to you about cases of medical breakthroughs or research in the alternative energy field. Those are instances wherein it is perfectly in line with what benefits society more to allow corporate research. We also were perfectly willing to concede, however, that sometimes it isn't. And in those cases, Mr. Speaker, what happens basically, the first thing that we told you was that they're not just barring the bad things from coming out, they're also preventing good things from happening as well. And that's not something, or that's not a trade-off they even wanted to acknowledge in this debate. We think that's really skirting what basically they wanted to say. We also never said that biases were a bad thing per se, right? Like what we told you was that peer review, retesting results, or the academe and its integrity in itself, and the marketplace of ideas was a perfectly legitimate and perfectly good way to be able to resolve these biases. What we told you, Mr. Speaker, was that corporations have more of an incentive and more ability to be able to skew the facts. That at the very least, even if, let's say, there are strong interest groups within society, corporations are also a voice that could allow for other things. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if they said that rich people can still fund, they're basically still erring on the side of somebody who is already well off in society promoting his own advocacy. So by that logic, if I were the CEO of a company, I could totally fund some research. I'm an individual anyway, and I'm doing that, right? Like we think that there is no principled justification for this side of the house as stands. Let's talk about the need to tie up. Because basically what we told you was that there was a lack of funding, and more to the point, there was a will or a lack of political and social will to be able to fund these things. There was no real response to this, except to say that it's not just the state who will fund it, right? Like they seem to think that the rest of society who had a lot of money and a pot of gold to be able to give to all random academics. We don't think that's the case. The assertion, Mr. Speaker, from Third Affirmative that corporations are more risk-averse than universities is absurd. Because these corporations, as we told you, had more reason to do this because they're also capable of benefiting more. They're also capable of risking more. Basically what they said was that, well, the academe is not about money, and apparently in the land of the mural of butterflies and rainbows, it automatically means that corporations therefore, Mr. Speaker, that the academe therefore is perfectly fine and perfectly capable of conducting all of the research that society society needs. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that that's something that they've ever been able to capably establish. A lot of research does go, Mr. Speaker, into things that aren't socially beneficial as well. There is a lot of research, for instance, on demographics and things like that that the academe does tend to focus on, whereas scientific research, or all of this research that corporations tend to do indeed have social, tangible impacts for the most part, because they are profit-oriented, because they do know where the money needs to go, because they are capable of taking those risks. For these reasons and more, Mr. Speaker, we think that Ateneo1 should go back to the Senate.
I'd like to invite the affirmative vice speaker to deliver the last speech of the quarterfinal.
Okay guys, see, in our discussion about climate change, there are people or there are academic researchers who say that, the problem's really, really bad. Other people say the problem's not as bad, but it's an eventuality. And there are people who also say that it's not a problem at all. And with all these avenues of information, a lot of people in society were starting to lean to the idea that it is bad, it's an eventuality, and we need to do something about it. But the moment like NYU or like the University of Sydney started to start to produce a research paper that says that climate change is not a problem, what we suggested on this slide is that it's going to convince a lot of people, it's going to dent the kind of consensus that's already been established. Now you make that bigger and you continue allow corporations to continue flooding these independent academic researchers. And something that's going to happen since they're also vulnerable and so limited, lacking of funding, right? Like what they said. We think what's going to happen is that you're going to even further pervert the kind of research that's going to happen here, and you're going to allow them to further change the way people think about issues and bend it to their own corporate logic. Now that's the harm that we're talking about, and that's a realistic harm that they've never dealt with. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to look at a couple of points. The first point will be random pot shots at our policy, and secondly about how they improve the quality of discourse. So let's go at the first one, right? Random pot shots. Because our only argument was the idea of faking results. And we were quite clear on this. We proposed that there was no such thing as an overriding good. It's an argument about persuasion, it's an argument about dogma and voice. And what's going to happen here is that you're going to allow them to dominate and hegemonize the kind of dogma that exists in the particular discourse. And we think that's harmful, right? Look back to my preamble, the NYU thing. So we don't think that necessarily helps. And that's the only rebuttal that they had to the kind of 4 pieces of analysis that I gave, right? The idea of perception, respectability, benefits of open source research, and short term. And if you just weigh it up, guys, I think ours are a lot more realistic, and it's just better, right? At least rebuts it. Now the second idea, this concept, like they said, it's not anti-majoritarian. These people will still research for the good of society. We don't disagree. There are some nice corporations out there, like McDonald's or something like that. But we think there are also areas where they are undeniably against the majoritarian consensus. For example, tobacco companies. What's happening here, like we said, is that even though they're researching to make cigarettes safer, they're also pushing for research that says that smoking is not bad at all. They don't have to fake results, because I think there's arguably a room for them to make such proclamations. But what basically happens when you allow them to aggrandize independent academic researchers is you close the spectrum a lot more. So the kind of decisions that I'm making is further compelled to a specific direction, something that we don't want. We want to open it up further because that's the kind of pursuit of knowledge that we think is important. So the second idea, right, improves the quality of discourse. I like the first point that he said, right? Oh, no, Pfizer wants to save the world, perhaps make, better Viagra pills or something like that, right? And the only way for them to do this is to flood independent academic researchers. We don't see the logic. They have their own corporate scientists. They can do whatever they want. They can save the world in their own backyard. We don't see why there's a need to aggrandize independent academic researchers who make the active move not to join these corporations because they have an opposing viewpoint. We don't see the logic behind that at all. Secondly, right, and this was I think the only point that could have won them but didn't really win them, is the idea that, there might be a premature death anyway, so therefore there's no difference. But we give several responses to that, right? The first response is that we believe in the free market. If the particular research is good enough, people will step in and research it anyway. Secondly, we argued, right, if you want to do it, then do it in your own backyard anyway. And thirdly, we argued that the moment you allow corporations into the calculus, what's going to happen is that you are going to guarantee the death of alternative viewpoints, and you are going to diminish risk-taking. Arguments that me and Sana made never once dealt with. They went to the next idea, right? Self-interest will suddenly reign. No shit, everybody is self-interested, right? And we have no problem with that. What we want to do is pit ambition against ambition, and that's the whole point of diversity in discourse that we are trying to seek for. What they're basically going for is that you're going to homogenize everything or narrow it increasingly. Something that we think is bad. Or secondly, we think that's a concession already, right? You're already saying self-interest is bad, but you are going to perpetuate one viewpoint 2.1 point of self-interest, you're going to further undermine the ability for people to make rational choice. Mr. Speaker, it's easy, right? The girls want to go to the semis. We suggest Dongdaemun, Sinchon, and also like some other areas in Seoul, because we think the shopping is really excellent. We're going there instead.